Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Can you hear me without the microphone? Yeah. Okay, yes, so welcome, Teaching Voice. Welcome to the fall 2022 Fall Forum of the Harvard-Radcliffe Club of Rochester. My name, as I think just about everybody knows, is Oliver Griffin. I have the privilege of serving as president of the aforementioned club. Before I introduce our distinguished guests, allow me to take this opportunity to thank various individuals very briefly for contributing to this endeavor. Channing Pollock, our secretary, who had a family commitment which precluded his attending this event, warrants our gratitude. Of course, our guest speaker for traveling all the way from Geneva. All of you do for deigning to come, both in person, and welcome also to everybody joining us via Zoom. I hope that you can hear me. Excuse me. I'd like to thank Mark and Rosie, the executive director of the Academy of Medicine, for arranging this gathering tonight, and Dr. Sid Sobel, a very distinguished member of our board, who then reserved this venue, and I hope has logged on or will log on shortly to join us. Let me now very briefly outline the format of tonight's event before introducing our speaker. After I've introduced him, he will give his presentation, and we will subsequently open the floor to a question and answer session. Therefore, we ask that, number one, you refrain from posing any questions until our speaker has concluded his presentation proper and the question and answer session has begun. And secondly, that if you choose to engage our distinguished speaker, that you limit yourself to a query or queries and refrain from holding a presentation of yourself or on your own. Because we intend to host one and not multiple presentations this evening. So having said that, let me now introduce our speaker, which will echo what you see here in front of you. In July of 2022, President Emeritus Mark D. Gearan was named the 30th president of Hobart and the 19th of William Smith College. He previously was president, as we know, of Hobart and William Smith Colleges from 1999 until 2017, during which time the college's endowment doubled as he oversaw a capital campaign that raised $205 million in order to support facilities and annual giving, established 168 new scholarships, and completed 80 significant capital projects. During his first presidency, Gearan made substantial commitments to diversity and inclusion, propelled the college's environmental efforts, and grew programming in career services, civic engagement, student services, and study abroad. After leaving Hobart and William Smith in 2017, he served as president in residence at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and in 2018 was appointed director of the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has served in a variety of roles in American politics and government, including White House Communications Director, White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Vice Presidential Campaign Manager for Clinton Gore, 92, and Executive Director of the Democratic Governors Association. In September 1995, President Bill Clinton appointed Gearan as the 14th Director of the Peace Corps, where he oversaw the expansion of the Peace Corps program into South Africa, Jordan, and Haiti, as well as the establishment of the Crisis Corps, which sent former Peace Corps volunteers into crisis areas for 6 months or less to help during emergencies. A cum laude graduate of Harvard College and Georgetown University Law Center, he holds 13 honorary degrees. He and his wife, Mary Hurley Gearan, have also served as interim faculty deans of Winthrop House. His presentation this evening is entitled National Service in the 21st Century. President Gearan.
Wow, what a nice introduction. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome back to Rochester. Brought you a little snow to liven things up here, driving down the thruway. But I am thrilled to be here with all of you and certainly honored by the invitation. The Harvard Club of Rochester has always been a nice collegial and wonderful convening. Grateful for all your volunteer service and interviewing great prospective students and all the great leadership that comes through the club. And happy to be here for your fall forum, and what a beautiful space. I don't know that I've ever been here. It's just a beautiful place to have a convening. So thank you very much for having me. I do see two former members of my faculty here at Hobart William Smith, Professor Alan Frischman, who himself was a Peace Corps volunteer, Professor Joel Curran, who's here. So I kind of feel like I'm at a faculty meeting. So I did appreciate Professor Griffin admonition to limit to one question. And to remind you, Alan, questions end with a question mark. You know? But I do prize their colleagueship and their friendship over the years, and they represent the very best of Hobart William Smith and what our faculty offer to our students. I, as Oliver said, have returned to Hobart William Smith after 5 years of being back at Harvard. So I have a bit of a checkered history, 18 years as president, and then 5 years away, as it were, and then coming back this summer for this position. So we're very honored and excited to be back at this time. And I thought I'd offer just some reflections on democracy and civic life and the opportunities for higher education to blend some of the spheres of what I've spent a lot of my time and career. And I would look forward to some of the opportunities for questions and conversation and so forth. But it is interesting to be discussing these issues because we, of course, meet in interesting times, to say at the very least. Days after the critical midterm elections that brought forth interesting results, depending on how you view our politics, but I think encouraging results for some of the cohorts of particularly young people in voting. We meet weeks after the Supreme Court decisions and oral arguments, not decisions, but oral arguments on the Harvard case with the University of North Carolina on use of race in admissions that has enormous implications for higher education. We meet at times where days on college campuses reflect the deep polarization I think we see in many aspects of our civic life, and certainly colleges and universities are not immune to any of these trends. So all of those threads in many ways intersect. And I think the opportunity for those of us in higher education is to really take advantage of some of those things that I think are very important. So my perspective, and this was nicely covered in the introduction, but as a reflection of having served as a White House staff member, as Deputy Chief of Staff and Communications, so in that space, and certainly my work as Director of the Peace Corps, and directing the Institute of Politics at Harvard these past 5 years or so, during the Trump years and all that meant for American civic life. And then my first chapter and term as a college president. But returning to Geneva and to Hobart and William Smith after 5 years has been interesting in how to look at issues and see things. We've all experienced deja vu when we encounter something that's new, but it feels as if we've seen it before, right? Everyone's had that feeling. But I was struck by a reference that I read of Adam Grant proposing vu-ja de, which is the reverse of deja vu. that we face something that is indeed familiar, right? But we see it with a fresh perspective that enables us to gain hopefully new insights into it. So coming back to Geneva after 5 years, I have a lot of vuja de. And looking at higher education, looking at the very same institution where I was for 18 years, and thinking about the responsibility of higher education in our civic life. When I was asked to come back by the board of trustees, I was telling my former colleagues, this was not what I ever thought would happen. I was frankly minding my own business on Cape Cod, and the phone rang. But certainly a very soon decision to return at this moment, an institutional moment for an institution that I have long prized and admired so much of what happens there. But the essay by E.B. White, the title came to mind. And the title was Once More to the Lake. Right? Hobart William Smith sits very prominently on beautiful Seneca Lake. So I remember the title, but not enough about E.B. White's essay. But I went back and read it, and it's a very E.B. White essay. It's lovely, but he tells the story of going back to a lake in Maine that he had visited every year as a boy, and returning then as an adult with his young son, and looking at the lake and reflecting on that and all that has changed in the years since he was a young boy. But of the lake, he writes, the lake was constant and trustworthy. Constant and trustworthy. And I thought that's such an interesting phrase. And that has certainly been my perspective. Going back to Geneva, the Seneca Lake is like White's observation of that main lake, constant and trustworthy. And so many of the elements at Hobart and William Smith, even in my vuja de frame, are constant and trustworthy. But what also calls out to me is how much has changed in those 5 years since I moved from Geneva, New York to Cambridge, Massachusetts. When you look at those 5 years, certainly the pandemic, certainly the issues of increased political polarization, challenges to our democracy, the murder of George Floyd and racial reckoning, all of that in these 5 years. And so many of the attendant issues of those very much threading into all of our daily lives, but certainly those of great import to higher education, for those of us that care about higher education, extraordinary impact. And so tonight with this background, I want to make an argument for an enhanced civic focus in higher education, one with an expanded prioritization of service and public purpose. Because I think now more than ever, and while there's been threads in a place like Hobart and Smith, or certainly the universities here in Rochester, there's certainly a fair amount of that. But at this time, given the changes that I mentioned in terms of our civic life, I think the imperative to repair and refresh so much of our democracy is more important than at any other time in my career working in higher education. So the responsibility and the opportunity, I think, for higher education institutions to make a difference is that much more significant. And I think a group like this would be a fun group to have some conversation and get your perspective. To put it in perspective, or at least to start, I think it's important to acknowledge and really celebrate the fact that higher education in the United States has been a very forceful and significant and dynamic presence in our democracy. There's no question. Thomas Jefferson observed that the basis of our government is the opinion of the people, right? And so the opinion of the people so much shaped by a strong, certainly K through 12 education, but higher education's roles in preparing leaders in society. Anthony Del Banco, the writer and very thoughtful academic, thoughtfully writes about how democracy really requires education to flourish. When he said, the best chance we have to maintain a functioning democracy is a citizenry that can tell the difference between demagoguery and responsible arguments. He has a great book that I would commend to you. It's called College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be. And he quotes a professor of moral philosophy at Oxford a century ago, John Alexander Smith, as saying the following. This is how Professor Smith would greet his students 100 years ago. Gender notwithstanding. Gentlemen, nothing that you will learn in the course of your studies will be of the slightest possible use to you in the life after life, save only this, that if you work hard and intelligently, you should be able to detect when a man is talking rot, and that, in my view, is the main, if not the sole purpose of education. When a man is talking rot. I think if we were to contemporize Professor Smith, it might be when a man or a woman is talking BS. So again, nothing is more important in the slightest possible use to you if you can't tell the difference. And I quite agree with that, even in this age where truth is questioned, but that inquiry is so important. So American higher education, and for me, I can speak most comprehensively about our slice of it, small residential liberal arts education, has done so much to advance our democracy, and graduates in higher education, like all of you here, go on to make a real difference. We know what higher education means to family lives, to our society, in terms of income generation, satisfying careers. We know those that have the advantage of study abroad programs and global education. It's strongly associated with their own civic life and appreciation of that. But it brings us then to this, I think, very critical time in our democracy. The challenges that I mentioned in these 5 years, seen most evidently and with concern to the challenges to our democracy, the insurrection at the Capitol. And I think a genuine concern from scholars and practitioners alike, really questioning the long-term viability of our cherished democracy and the pillars that are in it. So here's this kind of paradox that I invite you into thinking with me. We have this time of enormous moment. We have a time when very serious scholars and practitioners are questioning the long-term viability of our democracy. Yet there are some paradoxes that I would offer. The first is this: young Americans are still pretty significantly engaged in civic life. This is the good news, the very good news. There has been a steady increase in voting in recent midterm and presidential elections. That is to be celebrated, given all the issues before. Consider 2 years ago, 54% of young voters cast ballots in 2020, the presidential cycle. The previous presidential cycle, it was 45%. 54%, 45%. In 2018, the midterm election, 36% of younger voters participated, and that was up from the previous midterm of 25%. So we've had this steady stepped increase. At the Harvard Institute of Politics that I was directed before coming back here, we do a survey of young Americans 18 to 29 years old and asking a whole battery of questions. In our recent poll, we found that 40% said they would definitely vote this year. And we'll see how it finally nets out, but a lot of the observers of this most recent election are confirming this very significant younger vote number. And remember, demographically, young Americans are quickly becoming the largest voting bloc moving through the system, very significant. Against this data, all the concerns that they have, that you've all seen other data recording about mental health and awareness feeling under attack, concerning cross threads about what the burdens that young Americans are facing. Yet, the good news is, again, this paradox, amidst all our challenges, young people very much engaged, very much present in the political process. It's also the case that higher education is being challenged at this time. Yet, again, it still maintains, I think, a pretty credible and essential ladder of opportunity for students going to college and university. And I would argue a pretty fundamental building block for our democracy to be able to sift out the rot, as Professor Smith said 100 years ago. But again, sadly, recent surveys evidence that while higher education enjoys public support generally, it is waning, and it varies by age and political affiliation. Consider some of this from the New America Survey, showing a 14-point decline since 2020 to today, to the question, colleges and universities have a positive effect on the way things are going in this country. 14-point drop in 2 years. 55% said that higher education has a positive effect on the country. 42% said it was negative effect on the country. That compared to 58% last year and 69% in 2020. This pandemic and what its effect has had is significant. There is some good news, of course. About 3/4 or 75% said post-secondary education offers a good return on their investment, down from 80% in 2020, but still a commendable number. The partisan divide, like so many things in life, exists here as well. The partisan definition of that. 60% of Republican voters strongly or somewhat agree that college makes you lose your common sense, compared to 15% of Democrats. 30% of Republicans surveyed said they believe that a college education is the best way to get ahead. So it breaks down in concerning ways on partisan lines. So my argument is that given this proud history in fostering democratic values and accounting for the troubling polarization in our society and civic life, and these concerning trends in higher education, colleges and universities, higher ed generally, should really redouble their efforts to promote service, to promote the collective good, to promote public purpose at every possible moment. It'll be good for our society, good for citizenship, certainly good for higher education, to summon our students to what are these nonpartisan ideals, affirmatively nonpartisan ideals. Back to Anthony Delvaco when he wrote, "A college should not be a haven from worldly contention, but a place where young people fight out among and within themselves, contending ideas of the meaningful life, and where they discover that self-interest need not be at odds with the common concern for one another. We owe it to posterity to preserve and protect the institution our democracy depends on." And I quite agree with that. So with a determined and concerted effort, there are many ways to cross this divide, I think, of modeling engaged citizenship for the 21st century. Certainly in voting, to make it easier, to make it registration easier. This is what higher education could do. Reminders, certainly engagements, messaging, perhaps having a holiday or release during that important day of election day. Anyway, to signal the importance of our most fundamental responsibility is to vote. Secondly, community service. I suspect everyone here does their own version of this, but if we could very much broaden that and integrate it through service learning courses across the country, and working to appreciate and model a level of activity for our students of their civic duty. Brian Stevens, the lawyer and author of Just Mercy, and founded the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, makes what I think is a very brilliant point of proximity, the power of proximity, saying we cannot create justice without getting close to places where injustices prevail. We have to be proximate to them. So service work, community service work, places students proximate to some of the challenges in our society by doing that. And that will in turn, I think, enhance society, enhance our civic life, and broaden their definition of what it means to be a citizen. In Geneva, we have a collective impact model. There are many different ways, certainly the University of Rochester and RIT and the other colleges here and have impressive work within the community that I've seen and spoken in the past with their presidents about. And then finally, I would say there are ways where as a nation, we could elevate service. I was honored to serve as the vice chair of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. And we made several recommendations to increase the opportunities of service, making a common platform where individuals could learn about service opportunities, creating an ethos of service in our country where, if not mandatory, but there is an expectation of service in our country, or that we certainly fully fund opportunities like the Peace Corps, like AmeriCorps, and others where young people, and those not so young, could serve. How do we break down the barriers that exist? So as a nation, a lot could be going, but certainly higher education's role in this regard. So in sum, my argument is really a call to service. I think it's already a part of so many institutions' DNA in higher education. So much is done, but now feels very different. Now coming back with Bhai Bhuja Day, understanding what higher education can do, understanding this interesting paradox of supreme challenges yet continued impressive engagement of students, understanding how higher education itself is being questioned in terms of its ultimate role, and a central role, I believe, to promote democracy. But recognizing all of these threads, I think now more than ever, a broad-based expansion of the ethos and ethic of service, certainly K through 12, but importantly, from my perspective, at the college and university level would be important. Congressman John Lewis was a guest at Hobart and William Smith several years ago when I was there at convocation. And he told our students something very interesting in his convocation address. I think Alan and Joel were probably there. But he said, find a way to get in the way. Find a way to get in the way, right? And I think that is the kind of admonition that so many of us feel about so many of the issues that we're dealing with. I come back in this role at this time, energized by what I see. Certainly what I saw with Harvard students I worked with for the past 5 years, undergraduates and Kennedy School students, and what I see at today's Hobart and William Smith. But the times are different. The challenges are different in just these 5 years. So how do we capture that dynamic and work for the kind of change that would prepare us for the balance of this century? So with my thanks, certainly to Professor Griffin for this nice invitation, I'm happy to have a conversation both in person and those guests joining us over Zoom.
Thank you very much, President Gearan, for that very engaging presentation. So while you consult do you see anyone in the chat room?
We don't at this point.
Question? Okay, then let me hand the microphone around. Pass it around.
So what mechanisms have you discovered are most effective in engaging faculty and students with adjacent disadvantaged communities?
Well, I mean, I think as an academic matter, service learning, meaning a curriculum or that would engage service work. There's community service, which is always a good thing, working at a food pantry or whatever. What is, in my view, even enhanced is a service learning course that would allow for a reflective component of that service work in the classroom. What does it mean? What are the underlying economic issues associated in my example case of a food pantry? So, as Brian Stevenson would urge, bringing students into this proximate appreciation of some of the challenges, right? In this case, food scarcity, poverty. And in a structured environment with a service learning course that many of our faculty do, and that's significant in higher education, but could be enhanced certainly. And I think it allows for that kind of dialogue in the case of a student, the point of reflection. So they're thinking about it in a much more comprehensive way. and allowing for a discussion about what could be changed. What is the action that could be ameliorating some of the challenges, I would say. So that's one of the things that I think. And then I think faculty members have an extraordinary role individually and collectively. Kind of the curriculum reflects that. That is the province of the faculty in every good college and university. What are the courses? What are the approaches? What are the pedagogies that are employed to be contemporary, responsive to today's students? And thinking through this democratic lens that I would offer, in addition to the service of what can we be doing and talking about this democracy and the challenges that exist. You know, there's an interesting book that I would commend to you by E.J. Dionne, you know, the Washington Post columnist, who argues for universal voting. Read mandatory voting, right? Universal is a nicer word than mandatory. It's going to eat your peas. It's a little mandatory. But some nations have it, including Australia, right, and others. And if you don't vote, you get a parking ticket citation or variation of that. But it does place the importance of voting. It might crowd out the effects of the polls of each party, right, nominating individuals by each party that might be more extreme if the entire population was voting. Anyway, he makes an interesting argument for it that might be. I commend his book to you.
Would your ideas about this be part of the backbone of a new curriculum? Would it be something that would be touched on every year in the 4 years of a student's education?
That's a good question. Backbone. I think it's authentic to the every institution would be different, right? And admittedly, my reflections tonight is through a pretty American perspective, right? Voting, you know, and I'm mindful of that, particularly when I was at Harvard, where half the Kennedy School were international students, right? So you'd have to kind of frame it in terms of institutional mission, moment, demographics, and the like. If not background, Joel, I would say that I think as an institutional thing, it needs to be elevated. For instance, this very simple act of registering to vote and then to vote, which is not easy in 2022 America. I don't know if any of you have had the occasion to vote absentee, but the times I've done it, I'm reading it, you know, I went to law school, and it's like this, it's dense and hard and timely and everything about it. I think an institution has to make it be an institutional imperative, because where does it usually land in a college or university? A bunch of students tabling in the dining room, like they would for, you know, a dance concert or a fraternity party or any other student activity. That's where it's landed right now in most colleges, which is fine. But is that what it should be? What's the institutional? We're getting all sorts of information. We registered them, we retrained them, we did their basic civic right. Really, the infrastructure to say, no, this is an institutional priority is going to help you register. Welcome to Geneva, welcome to Hobart-Smith. You're from Texas. Here's how you get an absentee. Because we're tracking everything else about you, right? And training everything, you know, which is good. So I think the values of the institution have to be institution specific, but if not background, the elevation from beginning to end every year frequently, making that civic state. We don't ask much of citizens. What do? Vote, pay your taxes, turn your clocks back at Eastern, you know, daily. I guess that's going away, you know. Oh my gosh, it really is a faculty meeting now. We got one more Hobart-Smith. faculty. No. But a Harvard alumnus, welcome Professor Singhal, that's good. So that's what I would say. I mean, that's, I think if not the backbone, then kind of a core value that could be exposed in lots of ways. Messages from institutional leadership, courses that define and kind of enhance that, speakers that visit. There's ways that this could be. I'd like to think we've done a pretty good job, we, the collective, at Hobart Williams-Smith, but it can always be better. Mark?
Yes, thank you, Mark. So Mark, this is from Matthew Losick on the chat. Terrific to see you. He says, I remain forever proud to have served in the Peace Corps as a volunteer in the Peace Corps staff under your extraordinary leadership. Question, you speak of the role of national service in calculating the values and responsibilities of citizenship. Many believe the removal of the draft injured that process for future generations. What is your perspective on restoring mandatory national service?
So it's interesting because, as I said, I served as vice chair of this National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. And it was the first time, created by the Congress, it was the first time where they put the military and public service groups together for these recommendations. We spent 3 years, traveled around the country. The initial impetus to create this was the question of the selective service system. In the time-honored tradition of the Senate, when there's a hot potato, you form a commission. And the operative question was, should women be required to register? Hence the commission, in part, was put together. So it's kind of this military question of the United States selective service system. And then how do you enhance service? So the first part, of course, every 18-year-old is still required, male, in the United States to register for selective service system. Many don't know they're doing it because depending on the state, it's threaded into your license, but there's no rite of passage, right? There's no statement about citizenship at all. There is a selective service, it's operational, it's 20 or $40 million a year. There's an effort that's ongoing. Our recommendation at the end was that we would, the first instance was, should we have it at all? Why do we have a selective service? Does anyone really think we're going to have a draft? You would have to have the Congress vote on, the president. You know, it would be a very significant effort to even have a draft. In the end, the commission concluded that it is ultimately an insurance policy. Should we have an extreme emergency? And I was very comfortable with that position, that it is a necessary thing. But indeed, when not any military position that when we put in the affirmative, every military opportunity is available both to men and women. So there is no reason not to provide service opportunities to women. So our recommendation is that all Americans should be required to serve. So then the next question we wrestled with is the question of mandatory service. And initially I thought, let's come out, let's be bold. Let's say, yes, it should be a mandatory service requirement in the country, until you sort of burrow in to the math. Every year, I think it's 4 million Americans. Is that right? Oh boy, I'm rusty. I think it's 4 million Americans turn 18. Could that be right? Probably. Or maybe it's 40. It's a huge number. Might be 20. It's embarrassing. I used to know all this. But anyway, to put it in perspective, here's the numbers. The Peace Corps has 7,000 volunteers. AmeriCorps has maybe 50, 60,000. Even if you had Senior Corps, you are under 100,000 Americans that are in any full-time service work. So the notion that you are going to have a mandatory service for millions and millions of Americans organizationally would be an extraordinary effort. In a lot of the feedback we received was from nonprofit heads who said, we don't need someone who's conscripted to work in my Boys and Girls Club, my whatever community center. So we elected not to. What our frame was based most inspired by really was General Stanley McChrystal, who gave a talk at the Aspen Ideas Forum several years ago, where he posited that there's 1 million young Americans in military service, right? Why shouldn't there be a concomitant number in non-uniformed public service in some way? So if you could get to 1 million over time. So that's how we recommended that to work over time. It is a bit of a moonshot to get to those numbers, but over time we could. Certainly the interest is there. When I was director of the Peace Corps, we had 10,000 applications each year for 3,500 positions. Now, I don't know that 6,500 Americans who were not selected for the Peace Corps would be ready to be a Peace Corps volunteer. But wallow in that math. There's 10,000 Americans raising their hands, like Alan Frischman did, to go to some of the most desperate places on the planet in service and peace and friendship on behalf of the United States. And we say no because of the budget. That to me is scandalous. Same thing in AmeriCorps. Huge interest in serving. So we could get to these numbers, the concomitant numbers on the non-military side, but then we would have a really significant cohort, and it would just build in what we said in our report, kind of an expectation of service. It wouldn't be mandatory, but there would be an ethos of service in our country that over the arc of one's life, you will give back to your community in a significant way. You know, everyone here, I'm sure, is engaged in individual ways, but kind of a significant opportunity of service to the community. That's how we left it. So, thank you for the question.
Yeah, question. Hi, Mark. Can you hear me okay without the microphone? First of all, I agree 100% with your premise. When I graduated from Georgetown in 1981, some close friends, about 12 guys, it was guys at the time, went to Nicaragua, and they were fine young men at the time, and they turned out to be excellent adults, and then they can speak to it, how much it meant to them and how much they got out of it. So I certainly agree with your premise that there should be more done as far as encouraging college students to get involved in service work, 100%. But my question is different. My son graduated from Georgetown in 21, and he is a Republican. And sorry, and
It happens in the best of families.
So I just read you the 2 quick sentences and just get your comment on it. The conclusion of an article about diversity of thought in colleges. Does it may be unreasonable to expect that college faculty will reflect an ideological diversity of the larger society, but academia needs to find ways to broaden the dialogue on college campuses so that students, both on the left and the right, understand politics from more than one point of view. And just primarily through talking with him, I thought he had legitimate concerns about speakers who were being brought in, having more of a left leaning to them. And I think regardless of how you R or D, personally, I feel that there should be more diversity in college campuses as far as voices from the left and right, and just your comments about your own, over William Smith or colleges in general and that concept.
Right. No, it's a good question, fair question. And yeah, I think endemic to any well-educated citizen is this ability to separate what is rot and not.
Right.
And part of that is exposure to ideas, comfortable and not. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that most colleges and universities are more liberal than not, right? Many of us graduated from Harvard, that is frequently lampooned as, pick your Kremlin on the Charles, everything, right? Indoctrinating all these people. I have to say, it's kind of funny if that's the case.
Didn't work on DeSantis.
It didn't work on half the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Or this, so our proof points aren't particularly laudatory if indoctrination is the charge. Justice Roberts, or DeSantis, Senator Cotton, I could go on. You get the point. But it's hard to disagree that, of course, campuses are more progressive than most campuses. Question to me, though, and there's lots of reasons for that, but I don't think you can draw the line to indoctrination and outcomes because of examples that we both cited, right? Having said that, I think it is important for students of all political engagement to feel comfortable on campuses. And that is important, and that is challenging in these times, right? I directed the Institute of Politics during this period of time, right? And so bringing different voices to campus is important. We started a conservative caucus of students. When I invited Governor Chris Christie to come last spring to Cambridge, I said, would you meet separately with the conservative caucus? He said, Mark, do you have a phone booth? What are you talking about? But of course there were, and he met with them, and I was appreciative of that. So I think it's important to build out those spaces. I think an interesting question for any institution is there a red line here in this time? Is it anyone? Is it supporting of the big lie? Is it, at what point, particularly at an institution like Harvard, do you credential someone with views to which the values of the institution, the motto of the institution, Veritas, would not support? Therein is the Rubik's Cube. At what point does an institution say, we're all for diversity of ideas, but is there any ideas? Harvard has a burden because it's a bit of a dry cleaner. You can go and burnish your image because you lectured at Harvard. You were a fellow at Harvard. It's an enhancing career statement. So what does the institutional responsibility have for that? So I take the point, but in its execution, I think there's some threaded questions that you'd want to think about. Certainly for Governor Christie and Senator Cotton. I mean, of course, you'd have to have. And lastly, I would say what feels different to me in today's collegiate environment is this polarization. And why is it any different? We're going into Thanksgiving, and many of you are probably dreading the cousin, the aunt, the uncle that with a different point of view.
Certainly.
Right? That's what we all, right? It's no different on college campuses. When I was at Harvard, my undergraduate roommate was the president of the Republican Club. When we graduated, he went to work for Richard Nixon in San Clemente. I went to work for Robert Drinan, the congressman from Massachusetts, who was the first member to offer an impeachment resolution against Richard Nixon.
I do a class.
Yeah, right. So he is now a right-wing talk show host and Washington Post columnist, Hugh Hewitt. So we haven't agreed in years, but we texted me this weekend. We're, godparents to children, weddings. It's a friendship born in Winthrop House 40 years ago. Here's the more interesting question. Would that still be a friendship today, given this polarization? You look at some of the research, not just Harvard students, but young people. Would you have a friend with a different point of view? Would you date? Would you marry someone? I would like to say yes. That would be the, but in this highly charged, polarized environment, with that, it's a quite, and that's a very sad question, right? So I think institutionally, colleges and universities, that's why my argument for unrelenting focus on service and civic duty to kind of bring people together in common pursuit. That's what has to happen. Enough that went askew of what you were talking about, but it's complex. But thank you, son, for the question.
Thank you.
This question is something of a follow-up to your previous answer about mandatory national service. And it was several weeks ago, I believe, when President Biden made a statement advocating for raising the wages for members of AmeriCorps to the minimum wage, I believe for federal fiscal year 2024. And I have to imagine that your discussions on this commission that you vice chaired recently must have touched on this question. And I certainly can see the argument for increasing the compensation, right? If we're talking about achieving that goal that you held forth to us of increasing the number of folks participating in the AmeriCorps and the Peace Corps to match the number participating in military service, well, maybe increase the compensation so that it's not just minimum wage, but actually above minimum wage. And yet, as someone who served in the Peace Corps under your leadership, and you served in as a VISTA member prior to that as well, and you're now overseas in the AmeriCorps VISTA program here in Rochester, there's part of me that is still taken by that ethos of almost resisting the allure of capitalism. I want it to be accessible to people of low income backgrounds, as indeed I was. But at the same time, I wonder what your take is.
Yeah, what a good question, and thank you for your life of public purpose. That was a recommendation of our commission to raise it. And I think fundamentally it stems from the barriers to service that exist and what it means, aided and abetted by college debt, right? And I think we would all agree that we don't want the service opportunities like Peace Corps, like AmeriCorps, to be only available realistically to those with a financial advantage, right? And that's the concerning trend from those in the field, right? Who could do this, right? Given Peace Corps, but also AmeriCorps, without the kind of at least leveling of the playing field. So first and foremost, there's a lot of barriers to entry to full-time service like this. And one of them was the stipends. So I know just what you're saying, because there is this allure, this magnanimous sort of sense of citizenry that people evidence. But I think when it's balanced against the narrowness of those who are in line and able to do it, and to try to break down the barrier of entry, it does argue for that. So that's where we came down.
Consult chat. Is there anybody?
Should voting be required by federal law? Well, I don't know. You know, I would have said no, but I have to tell you, EJ's book kind of rocks you back a little bit, right? I mean, it makes you think, and particularly because it's this question of these polls that we're experiencing, and EJ touches on it, but just read Fareed Zakaria's kind of frame of the danger we're in right now, where each party, and then adding to this dysfunction of our democracy, kind of nominates candidates at their polls, right? They are the nominee, they run against each other, one of them wins, but the Congress, the national legislatures are increasingly populated by these extreme viewpoints, and it leads to this dysfunction. I think it was Mitch McConnell of all people I'm quoting, but I think he argues, I think there's a lot to it, that most Americans see our politics playing at the 40-yard line, right? Within 40, not in the end zones, right? And the primary process leads to a legislative victories of a lot of end zone political folks. Bringing back to EJ, part of the argument, if everyone was voting, if everyone was required to vote, you would have a more significant population engaged, which could be a good thing. And it might mitigate or ameliorate some of these polarities that exist. Would I require at this point? No. But EJ makes me think about it.
Before I ask my question, did a quick phone research, and you're right, 4 million people turn 18 every year.
Don't you love the internet?
That's what they say.
Thank you for fact checking
And
in real time. It's 4
in real
million,
time.
right?
Yes.
So again, you're great. So 4 million every year. And we have less than 100,000. I mean, in AmeriCorps, Peace Corps combined. So thank you.
And with regard to something that's been talked about later, one of the most interesting memories I have of discussion in my years at Harvard was going to the law school forum and watching Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi try to explain why he couldn't let James Meredith into the University of Mississippi in front of a Harvard audience and fielding some very sharp questions from the law school professors who were running the forum. I doubt that he would be allowed to speak on the college Harvard campus today, and it's too bad because it was an interesting discussion and taught me a lot about people I have never thought of. My question is, I did my service when the draft board sent me a letter, but my daughter-in-law, after graduating from Brown, did 2 years in the Teach for America program. And one of this was, of course, because she has a strong social commitment, but the other thing was because it affected her college loan status.
Right.
And it would seem to me that with the number of people who have student loans, that if you want some kind of an incentive to get college students to get more involved in public service, tying it to some forgiveness of their student loans might well be a way to make it work.
Totally agree. And that was some of our recommendations that, because you're right, Teach for America is such a brilliant effort. A lot of it is funded by the Corporation for National Service, so it receives that support. But you're right, that is a key part of it. And there's some in the Peace Corps, depending on the loan that you have, there's some, I don't know if you have the advantage of it, but depending on the type of loan you have, but not the kind of broad-based dent that would make a difference but I fully agree with you. Yeah. And I think institutions, this again, what is the role of higher education? What is the role of Brown University? Could they forgive some of the institutional loans with a commitment to service? This not all need be leveled at the federal government. There are institutions with kind of wealth and values in putting words and actions into meaning that when you commit to, service to underserved communities or whatever it be. Yeah. All right.
Thank you. So great discussion, and thank you again for coming to see us this evening and share your thoughts. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on what is the role of institutions in making for a more civically educated society. That is beyond just sort of sponsoring televised debates of national candidates.
Right.
What are some more creative ways that institutions can combat this scourge of disinformation that's out there, not just among students, but I'm talking about the broad public?
Yeah. What a good question. Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that we can go at this. Part of it is kind of frequently institutional leaders have a civic role. And I think there used to be a time where university presidents especially had a role. What Derek Bach said after his time in California every January was consequential. Kingman Brewster would reflect, and it was in the New York Times. There is an argument that college and university presidents are more timid than their presidents, right? Which is an interesting provocation to all of us for fundraising concerns, for getting caught in the swallow, for, I get it. And it's interesting to me because, of course, I came into this as the so-called non-traditional candidate, I think in the parlance of the search firm in 1999, lovely sanitized phrase, where my politics was no, right? But going to meetings with colleagues and kind of how they think about that and their civic engagement, I understand how it is a different journey. But I think there are a lot of ways where institutions, your question is kind of the institutional role, right? I think should exude it in all sorts of ways, kind of to really deep introspection from the curriculum to student affairs and student life, to the board level, to investment level, to the endowments, to allocation of resources. All of those things, I think, could greatly enhance our civic space.
Well, and also wonder about even making some, I don't know, courses available to
Oh,
the public or to
Yeah.
students who are in high schools. A lot of sort of say urban high schools
Mhm.
are really challenged
Yeah.
to provide challenging
Yeah.
education, not to overuse the word, to some of, especially the brighter students.
yes,
You know, if you're a suburban student, you do have access to these
Right.
kinds of courses. If
Yeah.
you're in an inner city school, it's very
Yeah.
difficult.
and the pandemic has only widened that divide. I quite agree. It's interesting, one of the things that we were thoroughly underprepared, it was not on our screen for this commission on military and national public service, is when we went around the country to various locations, what kept coming up in this space was civic education and the lack thereof. We hear it in this part of the country, everyone, you know, what do we do to enhance our democracy? That when the question is posed, what frequently came up, largely K-12, and then you go into it, and you realize, and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was early and active in this space of promoting civic education, K-12, is, so we put it in our report. It was not our charge, but you could not report faithfully to the Congress without stating what we had heard so much. So really to revitalize civics education in the country, because you don't just flip a switch at 18 and understand what it's like to be a citizen. And all of us grew up with a healthy dose of that, what it meant to be a citizen, right? In the collective. And increasingly, certainly fueled by a lot of our politics, I think our self-definition is more as a taxpayer. I grew up for most of my life thinking that we're a citizen first, right? And I think a frame now, which is inherently a more selfish or at least personalized view, not saying in any partisan term, which is the appreciation of the collective, right? So civics education, I think, does that in the basic formulation. I mean, you've read the kind of quirky reports and percentage of people that know the branches of government. I mean, the statistics are an embarrassment. But the curriculum has been crowded out. K-12 educators tell me, in terms of technology and other very worthy academic spaces. But we're left with a country, which brings, again, this wonderful paradox of young people's civic engagement and voting levels all the more exciting to me, given that they haven't had that. And I think if we really revitalize civic education, if we had a service council in the White House, if the president would bring the various streams of service, if we just elevated service at all levels, I mean, I think that all of that would be helpful.
Thank you. Yes, I'm kind of building on that question, curious, I work in K-12 education and it's struggling. It was struggling before the pandemic. It's gotten worse, particularly in places like here in Rochester. And you know, we have this wealth of institutions of higher ed here in Rochester, and I was saying with Geneva. Just curious your thoughts, you know, the role of higher ed in improving K-12 education, and particularly post-pandemic as we're trying to, you know, catch kids up. Do you see a role for tutoring, that sort of thing? Like how do you engage college students? Would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think I got very entranced with this so-called collective impact theory that I read an article in the Stanford Journal of Social Innovation on Cincinnati. And it sounds like kind of a pretty fundamental idea, but its execution is pretty complicated. The idea is, if a community gets together, the business community, the not-for-profit community, the faith community, higher education community, and aligns around common goals with common metrics and a backbone organization, you can really advance the ball. So I thought, that sounds good. Geneva's great, 13,000 people, we'll be the backbone organization. We'll get people together, got everyone around my dining room table, because we all see each other at Wegmans produce aisle. So it's, I mean, it's easy, the scale is very easy. But getting a common understanding of these are the priorities, it was all for the schools because our system was under state watch. And it's getting people not to do something they were doing. So if the Boys and Girls Club was doing this, we want to focus on that, or if the business sector was funding this, so its execution is harder. But years later, we started it as Geneva 2020, now it's Geneva 2030. There's been steady incremental gains in the school system, right? So I am struck by this collective impact. No one sector can do this. Each has their role. Geneva, New York, we just celebrated 200 years of Hobart. There's 50 other colleges that are as old. Harvard, thank you very much, Beatus. But we sit on the best real estate in town on a lovely lake with a very nice non-for-profit tax status, right? So what is our role? What can we bring to this equation? What can the business community and the not-for-faith communities? And so I think this collective impact in higher ed is good at convening, spaces. It's good at youthful energy. What we can bring is pretty significant, but it takes an organizational kind of commitment on all parts of that sector together. For us, our scale was our friend, right? Because it's small. But Rochester, I love it. It's doable. So that is this collective impact, I think, has started in Cincinnati and has now grown pretty significantly in other communities. I would commend it to you.
Right. You spoke of the importance of proximity in civic engagement and civic understanding. Are you aware of any higher education institutions that are experimenting with student housing, with low-income housing, mixed-use housing? It's a pretty radical concept. I'm sure parents are thinking, I wonder what the safety would be with that. But I think there's nothing better than putting a student right next door to someone who may be disadvantaged. Are you aware of anything like that?
I'm not, but I bet there are. I do know there's two institutions that, I don't know about the housing piece, but Trinity College and Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, I think, are in challenged parts of the communities, and their engagement with the community, the immediate environs, is very significant. And it's not just building more fences, but really making it a very porous, particularly the University of Pennsylvania, in pretty impressive ways, right? I don't know about housing. That's very interesting. I'm not aware of it, to be honest with you. Yeah, but I think Penn is generally regarded because of its particular placement within the city and the challenges there, as having put real institutional heft behind it to the benefit of the community and the university, I think.
To me, service has always been a question of mandatory versus people just stepping forward and volunteering. And the mandatory part of it forces people to be exposed to things they wouldn't ordinarily be exposed to, and to people they work with who they wouldn't be exposed to or get to know. And so several of the courses that I taught at Hobart-Smith were service required courses.
Yeah.
So the students all had to go into the Geneva community to do some sort of service. It was required for the course and write about it. And we talked about it in class. And to my surprise, pleasant surprise, many of them continued that service after the class ended the next semester and the next year. And so I'm not sure they ever would have been exposed to that if I didn't require it. And so the mandatory part of it sounds oppressive in some ways, but in some ways serves a good purpose. And so how about Hobart-Smith requiring a graduation requirement of mandatory service?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I
just want to add one footnote. I happen to be in Peru when they're having a presidential election and it's mandatory voting in Peru. And the place in Lima, it was going crazy because people were lining up for hours and hours to vote because the penalties were really severe if you didn't vote. Financial penalties, all kinds of penalties.
Yeah.
And so, it was amazing to watch, actually.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, to the required, as you recall, as the first full day on campus in Geneva, the first year class goes into the community for community service. That is a required part of orientation. It is part introduction to Geneva. It is part community service. It is extolling our values of civic engagement. And it's sort of a bonding, getting to know your fellow first years when they're all awkward with misplaced confidence coming to college or whatever it is, right? So I think there's ways to do it, but I think there's no match, as good as that is. And then we have several during the year for upper class students. And there's no question that if they're teased with that experience, they go back to that service site or to others of it. But I think the real sweet spot is in coursework, because you get the reflective community. Thinking about it is tied to, in your case, the economics of the particular service work that they were doing, but it can exist across every discipline, service learning courses. So, yeah.
We have any other questions?
Just really quick, building on that, are there any other things like internationally, are there any countries you think have done a great job on service learning that could be a model for us to think about?
They're for service learning or for mandatory service.
No, just general service learning.
So,
integrating in this.
You know, as I was at the Peace Corps, I brought together other national volunteer efforts, right? Peace Corps is obviously created in 1961 by President Kennedy. There are many nations that have a version of it. The British had the volunteer before the Peace Corps, Canadians, Japanese, they're all, so we brought us all together. I brought them all together in Washington for a convening. And it's pretty interesting what's happening out there. It's not a perfect clone, any one of us to the other, but we could learn a lot from it. Secondly, Larry Bacco, the president of Harvard, when he was at Tufts University, started the Talloires network, named for the city in France, Talloires, Talloirs, where Tufts has a retreat center. And he brought a few university presidents to attend. I was privileged to go in the Georgetown president, Jack DeGioia. We were the Americans, and to talk about what we could do internationally. And since that time, in the past 20 years, this network has grown to over 1,000 college, university presidents, chancellors, vice rectors, all committed to civic engagement in their countries. And we just hosted their convening, the Kennedy School and at Harvard this year with Tufts. And it's pretty interesting what's happened. So there's a range of it. The Talloires network is a pretty vibrant web page if you want to look at what individual universities are doing. And it's for a lot of countries with thriving democracies and not developing nations. But it is yet another reminder of higher education's role and opportunity, because when you see it, particularly in countries that have immense struggles and challenges, their work is particularly inspiring in my judgment. So I would commend that to you to look at.
Are there any other questions for our?
I'd like to just try one more, just as we're talking tonight. It seems to me it would be a good idea to take U of R grads and thank you for your service to Rochester City School District, which you're probably aware of. Our got some very disappointing test scores as far as 1 out of 50 reading at grade level or doing math or science at their appropriate grade level. And it's very disheartening, very sad to hear that. But I'd love to see college students and perhaps tied into forgiveness of debt, perhaps where I heard this number, $10,000, tied into teaching, and tutoring, teaching at these. I think we're 684th in the state. I heard today, the bottom, the last in the state.
Oh, really?
In Rochester City School District, and very sad. I love this community, and so I don't know. That seems to me like it would be a good idea to tie in for some forgiveness of debt. I'd love to see 1,000, 2,000 recent U of R, RIT, MCC grads, Hobart William Smith grads come into Rochester and help.
Well, particularly when you look at the learning loss and all that's, I'm not a K-12 expert by any stretch, but the challenges that are coming right through the stream of student populations. Yeah, I think there's no match for an engaged adult, even a college student, in the life of a young person. The modeling of that, the incentivizing of furthering oneself, and tutorial for whether that's, and there's a lot of models to draw on. University of North Carolina has this great thing on college counseling, having their students work with like local high school juniors and seniors on college counseling. They've just gone through the process. They're available at 1 a.m. for an email. There's a lot of real world buttressing to the hard work of college counselors that do. And I think the imperative, I'm sorry about the statistics that you referenced, but what concerns me and what I was fundamentally, I guess, sophomoric about, when the pandemic hit and we were then on Zoom, and Harvard, as you all know, was fully remote for 18 months, you could see the kind of, what the dazzling thing about Harvard College is the access they provide to students. We should credit and thank Larry Summers when he was president for really devising a system that really broadened the diversity of today's Harvard College. It is stunning in dazzling these students. But higher education, particularly residential, democratizes so much. They're all in the same house. They all have the same meal plan. I mean, people have different clothes and there's appointments that signal class and they get them. But generally, there isn't differential pricing for courses or housing or meal plan. And of course, the financial aid is significant thanks to the generosity of so many Harvard alums and families. The pandemic threw that all asunder. So we're all on Zoom screens. And now you can see connectivity that wasn't good. You can see someone who's in a very nice summer home or with their friends in a very nice resort area or not, or off screen. And I thought this might change our focus and perhaps our politics, because the inequities of education at a place of enormous privilege like Harvard College, the inequities were in stark relief, right? Now, we shouldn't feel too sorry. They're all going to get a Harvard College degree and they will go on to lead a great life. But the undergirding economic realities were profoundly evident to me, right? So that's Harvard College. Take a good-sized city urban school district, and it's even more complicated. So again, given where higher education stands or wanes in the American polity, but the youthful idealism of this generation of college students to make a difference, again, I've been so formed and touched by the privilege of serving as director of the Peace Corps. And at the end of the day, the lesson I take from it in many ways is the power of an idea, right? Pretty simple idea. Send mainly young people around the world to do good things and come back and share it to, with fellow countrymen. Pretty simple. But what has happened in these 60 years and grown so that when I was director, there were 6 members of the Congress who were returned Peace Corps volunteers, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. Donna Shalala, members of the cabinet, leaders in every sector, the power of this pretty, at the end of the day, simple idea. So that gives me inspiration, whether it's the collective impact for our little effort in Geneva, or others that could be in Rochester. There are examples and models and opportunities.
You consult the chat room one more time.
The chat room says,
Other question?
I'm done.
So let me take this opportunity to thank again our esteemed speaker for a most engaging presentation, to thank all of you for attending and a most engaging question and answer session. Well, thank you very much, and let me wish you also a happy and safe Thanksgiving break.
Yeah.